Already. Okay, we're ready to go. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to today's American Community Media Zoom news briefing. I'm Pilar Barrero, Associate Editor at American Community Media and co-organizer of these briefings with Sandy and with my colleague Sunita Sorachi. Thank you for the journalists joining us today from everywhere across the country. Over the past year, we have seen an escalation of federal and state actions that go well beyond routine election administration, including aggressive federal intervention, new laws or new bills, and administrative practices that shape who can vote, how votes are counted, and who controls election materials. These actions are often framed as election integrity or fraud prevention, but they raise fundamental questions about access to the ballot, federal power, civil rights, and democratic accountability. Today's briefing is designed to help reporters understand what the federal government and the states are doing right now around elections, how voting rights lawyers are responding through litigation and policy advocacy, and how these actions are affecting communities of color and other vulnerable voters. We invite reporters to post their questions in the chat, and we will take questions from the chat during the duration, and we will send video and follow-up materials after today's briefing. We'll begin with national election law expert with a national election law expert with experience in the federal government, followed by a voting rights litigator, and then we'll have civil rights leaders working directly with impacted communities. Our first speaker is Justin Levitt, professor of law at Loyola Law School, former White House senior advisor for democracy and voting rights, and a former senior official in the DOJ Civil Rights Division. Justin will provide an overview of what the federal government is currently doing through the Department of Justice, Congress, and other federal actors, as well as what states are doing to restrict, control, or otherwise shape access to voting, and what he believes these efforts are ultimately trying to achieve. Justin, please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Pilar, and I echo your thanks to the journalists who are here. I can tell you from my post in the White House, journalism, and particularly journalism that speaks to communities, is profoundly important. So I appreciate each and every one of you and the job that you're doing in helping to communicate to real readers and real people what's going on out there. I think Pilar set me a big task in talking about what everything is going on and what everybody is doing. I think the most prominent disruptions right now are coming from the federal government and coming from the executive branch. And I think they have a common theme in the president trying to project power that he does not have. And I'll get back to how that's working out, but I think it's really important to realize both the attempt and the limits on the success of that attempt. So we're used to, unfortunately, now describing things that the president can't do and then watching him do some of them. And the can't in that context is a legal can't. It means that he doesn't have operational permission to do things that he is nevertheless doing with the military, with immigration enforcement, with tariffs. He has an awful lot of power in an awful lot of areas, some of which he gets from the Constitution, some of which Congress has given him. But elections are different. And when I say that Trump doesn't have power in that area or that he can't do something, I mean legal constraints, yes, and those legal constraints are important. But just as importantly, I mean operational constraints. He doesn't have his hand on the switch that makes things happen with respect to elections or not. And that's really important because we're used to him being able to exercise his will even when there are legal limits. And in the elections context, he's not in charge. And the easiest thing that state and local officials who are in charge are doing is simply ignoring him. Or, when not ignoring him, telling him that they don't agree. And they're the ones who control American elections. So I think that you can view most of the actions that the Trump administration has taken through the lens of marketing. They're scary. They should be scary. They are highly unusual. But for the most part, they're not affecting real voters on the ground when it comes to the 2026 elections. An example, he's trying to collect voter files from states all across the country. He's not authorized to do that. But the states are fighting back and winning. He's issued an executive order, and I know Danielle's going to talk a little bit about this. That executive order directs some federal officials to do things. It purports to instruct state officials what to do. It's been blocked multiple times in the courts, and the states aren't complying because they don't have to. They don't have to listen. The president has talked about nationalizing the elections or canceling the elections. And most officials who actually run elections on the ground are treating the promise to nationalize elections or cancel elections exactly as they would treat the same thing said by the guy who's screaming at you as you pull off the freeway onto the exit ramp. They're just not listening because the president doesn't control nationalizing the election process or canceling the elections. It's just not up to him. And that's different from a lot of the other power that he exercises, and so it feels unusual. There is a little more power in Congress, and they're considering some pretty hefty restrictions as well. I say considering. Some of them have passed the House, but seem stuck, thankfully, in the Senate, at least for now. That takes some real effort. Some of these prospective laws would limit access to voter registration. Some of them would limit access to voting at the polling place. A lot of them are based in fear-mongering about fraud that simply does not exist as a predicate for restricting access. But I think, at least so far, most of those federal efforts have also been about marketing. They're dangerous if they pass, but there's enough headwind, in part caused by some of the other people you'll hear from on this very call, to help push back against some of those restrictions coming out of Congress. The other most prominent development for the 2026 midterms, I think, over the last year, has been changes to district lines in a number of different states, and there's the prospect of more changes to come. Highly unusual mid-decade redistricting for excessively partisan purposes or purely partisan purposes. You've seen Texas sort of start a cascade, and a number of other states either follow or respond. I think there'll be more district lines shifting in the months to come. That's the biggest change, and that may mean that voters find themselves in new areas electing new representatives, which might be in some areas cause for concern, but might be in other areas cause for opportunity. And particularly, redistricting and district lines work as a sort of seawall to guard against normal tides. But in the event of a voter tsunami, that comes right in over the top of the seawall. And all the signs so far point to really extraordinary turnout this coming fall, which is part of why you see the vigorous marketing from the White House getting increasingly nervous about that turnout, because most of the voters don't seem to be heading in the direction that the president would prefer. If I, in my minute and a half remaining, have one urge for you all covering these developments, it's to remember that elections are run pursuant to guidance that Congress enacts through laws, but they're run by state and local officials, and the communities that you're talking to can look to their state and local officials for the best guidance. The second thing I'd urge you to do is remember to communicate that these things aren't just happening to voters. Voters have agency here. Voters can push back both at the federal level and at the state level, and ultimately the strongest pushback to restrictive laws comes through voters exercising their rights at the ballot box. And the last thing that I would urge is, to the extent that you're able, absolutely report on some of the profoundly anti-democratic messaging and the anti-democratic wishes, and call attention when officials who should know better seem to be expressing things that are profoundly anti-democratic, but separate that from the actual capacity they have to bring their wish fulfillment into effect. You'll hear a lot of noise and a lot of chaos in the months ahead. I think very little of that will translate to chaos for voters. Voters have multiple modes to participate in a number of areas. voting early, voting by mail, voting at the polls. There's a lot of ground to cover. There are a lot of people in the country. And I think that for the vast majority of the communities that you're writing to, the elections this summer and this fall, the primaries and the general elections, are going to look an awful lot on the ground like they did in 24 and 22 and hopefully not 2020. I hope we're not headed for another pandemic, but 18 and 16 and 14, it's going to look regular on the ground despite all of the noise coming over the airwaves. And you all do a remarkably wonderful job in helping to separate the chaos and the noise from what's actually going on the ground. So thank you.
Thank you, Professor Levitt. And a question just popped up in the chat about something I was going to ask you. What's your take on the Georgia raid and the FBI showing up there and seizing the ballots from 2020? What do they want to do with that?
It's not clear. It's very weird. It's highly irregular and highly disturbing. I'll tell you that they're not likely to secure a successful prosecution based on it, which makes it even weirder. The only thing that's within the time limit to prosecute now from 2020 is the notion that somebody might have thrown something out that they weren't supposed to throw out in 2021 or 2022. That is, no misconduct from the 2020 election, even if there were some, and it has been proven again and again and again and again and again and again in the most heavily scrutinized election in history, that election proceeded as it should have. But nothing, even if there were something to find, they couldn't possibly prosecute anything from the 2020 election, which means I think that the conclusion I draw is that most of the noise was to feed the marketing. It had the predictable effect of stirring up conspiracy theory. We know that the director of national intelligence was actually at the site, and there is no reason, none, for her to be physically at the site other than to be seen at the site. There's absolutely no operational reason for her to be there. And all of this means, I think, that it's feeding into and stirring up conspiracy theory about what might have happened in 2020, which will lead to claims of fraud and noise about fraud that doesn't exist. And your ability, the journalists on this call's ability to inform the public about what the actual facts are, goes a long way to cutting through that noise.
There's a question in the chat. Carlos Roa, please ask your question. Carlos?
Thank you, Pilar.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, my question is, how deeply has President Trump succeeded in spreading distrust in the elections, and what could be the long-term consequences for the American democracy?
That's a great question. I am quite worried that he has succeeded substantially in spreading distrust where that distrust is not warranted. I want to be clear, we got a long way to go before we get to elections that are perfect. And there are plenty of ways that we could improve the election system, and I have worked for decades on improvement to those structures. But that's a far cry from the claims that elections are being rigged or stolen, or that there is widespread fraud in the system. Unfortunately, I think a number of voters have come to just believe that as an article of religious faith, in part because of the relentless messaging of the president, who's claimed fraud without evidence in every election since 2015, since he first came on the national stage, both in elections that he won and in elections that he lost. The interesting thing to me about this is that when people actually work in their local elections, even when election skeptics show up to serve as a poll worker, serve as an observer, or actually work behind the scenes, they come away with the most profound and deserved confidence in the election structure. The overwhelming response of people who actually go to work for their elections officials is, oh, there are actually quite a few safeguards to prevent fraud. Oh, the system actually works with a lot of belts and suspenders to make sure that people aren't unduly disenfranchised. that they come away with a lot more faith in the system having seen it up close. And so I think one of the ways that we're going to have to fight back against the distrust is by allowing people to see up close for themselves how things actually work. The minute that people get a view on the inside, it turns them around. And I'll tell you, actually, some of your stories collectively that have profiled election skeptics who have served as poll workers are doing an enormous service in educating the rest of the public about how things actually work on the inside. So thank you for those stories.
Thank you so much. I'm going to move on to our second speaker, but stay around for more questions later. Our next speaker is Danielle Lang. She's Vice President for Voting Rights and the Rule of Law at the Campaign Legal Center. Danielle has led challenges to many of the efforts that we've been talking about. And I would like you, Danielle, to walk reporters through, how people like you, voting rights lawyers, are responding to these efforts and what you're seeing out there and whether the courts are responding.
Thank you so much. And I want to all of Justin's comments about thanking everyone who's joining us today. Thank you for inviting us to have this briefing, and thank you for your attention, early and often attention to our elections this year. It's much needed and much appreciated. So yes, I've been tasked to talk specifically about the ways in which voting rights lawyers are responding to current threats and actions by the president, many of which Justin mentioned, and by the executive branch more broadly. And I'm going to do that as well as talk a little bit about how voting rights lawyers are looking forward towards the 2026 elections. So talking about what we're doing right now, I think is a very positive story about both the preparation of organizations like mine and our peers, and how closely we're working together to meet the challenges of this moment, but also of the courts, and the courts recognizing the limits on executive power in this area. If you've been following the news, generally, you may not have a positive view generally of how courts, or perhaps the Supreme Court, has been responding to abuses of executive power. That is simply not the story when it comes to elections in particular, I think, for many of the reasons that Justin already identified. Let's take the executive order case as a kind of paradigm example. In March of last year, the president came out with a lengthy executive order purporting to take charge of a number of places of federal elections and the running of federal elections, both by interfering with federal agencies that are involved with elections, and then also trying to threaten states into making changes to their elections. And basically nothing has come of that executive order as a result of both court orders and kind of state defiance. So I represent several organizations, including the League of United Latin American Citizens, as well as Secure Families Initiative, which is a military families group, and Arizona Students Association. We were the first to sue over this executive order, and were joined shortly thereafter by several of our peers, as well as states that also sued over this executive order. We quickly won a preliminary injunction on what was the kind of most immediate threat, which was his command that the Election Assistance Commission change the requirements for voter registration on the federal voter registration form. And why does that matter? The federal voter registration form was created by a 1993 law called the National Voter Registration Act, with the idea that it provides a backstop. Lots of states have their own forms. Most people actually use the state forms, but the federal form really serves an important role for where states don't make it very easy to vote, and also for voter registration groups that are trying to do work that is national in scope. And actually, one of the things that's most important about the federal form that I think is relevant to all of you is that it makes it easier for groups that are serving communities that don't speak English to provide the form in many different languages and to provide it to their national constituencies. And that was something we really put forward on behalf of the League of United Latin American Citizens, and that was quickly enjoined. That was an important victory, not only because it stopped a harmful thing from going into action, but I think equally it was important for the forceful message of the district court judge who wrote about a 100-page opinion there, in which she could not have said more forcefully, more directly, or more times in a well-supported way that the president has no constitutional power over elections. And every court order that has addressed that executive order since has parroted that language from the First District Court of DC, saying the president has no constitutional power to set rules of elections. There are two sets of actors in our constitutional order that have those powers. It is the states in the first instance, and it is Congress if it so chooses to act to set rules. All things that Justin already told you, but that now we have in really good court opinions. Moving forward in that case, we've now gotten a permanent injunction on that claim, as well as another claim where the court was trying to add a proof of citizenship to the form that folks can use overseas or for military voters. What was particularly odd about that demand from the executive order is that the Congress couldn't have been clearer about what it was trying to achieve when it created this special form. They call it a postcard. It has to be a postcard that uniformed and overseas voters can use to register to vote and request an absentee ballot. Postcard. And yet, the president was trying to create a new set of documentation requirements where you would have to send in perhaps multiple types of forms along with your registration. One of the staples of a postcard is that it doesn't have an envelope. So it cannot possibly include additional documentation requirements, and that's exactly what the district court held there. There is also an offensive that, so moving on from the executive order case, I want to tell you about a couple of other things quickly. One is that, as Justin mentioned, the Department of Justice is suing 25, maybe at this point, something along those lines, states, trying to seek their voter rolls. We have intervened on behalf of voters in a number of those cases, and our partners have intervened in others to represent the voters. The states are defending themselves, and we are representing the voters in protecting their voter data. And uniformly so far, the courts that have ruled on this have ruled that, once again, the Department of Justice has no base for hoovering up this amount of data. There was a question in the chat about kind of what justification they're using. There are a few different arguments the government has tried to use over the course of this crusade. They've largely focused on trying to use the Civil Rights Act, which provides for investigative authority for the Department of Justice to look into violations, and that might require seeking records from states about voting to look into civil rights violations. That in no way provides the government with broad authority to demand all the voter data for all of the states, with no kind of justification or basis for believing that they are in fact investigating any civil rights violations. To the contrary, they've been pretty clear in the public about the purpose of hoovering up this data, and it has nothing to do with enforcing the Civil Rights Act, and courts have been able to see through that quite clearly. So once again, good news from the courts rejecting these power grabs. And that's not, we haven't stopped there. Our organization is suing USCIS, the Citizen and Immigration Services, because they have banned voter registration activity at naturalization ceremonies. We have argued that that is arbitrary and capricious under the Administrative Procedures Act. The League of Women Voters, our client, has in the past registered upwards of 10% of all people who are naturalizing in the United States at those ceremonies. It is a beautiful and honestly sacred duty that they are performing there that they have now been banned from. And we are very hopeful that the court will reinstate their ability to do that work. Our partners and our partners are working on public records requests. We are staying ahead of what the federal government is planning here. And that's what I want to close with very briefly, is to say there is so much work going on right now, but our organizations are also forward looking. And I can promise you, I've been in a lot of these conversations. The voting rights advocates have the voters' backs for the 2026 elections. They are prepared for any attempts for interference. I wholeheartedly endorse Justin's view that much of this is messaging, but to the extent that there are real threats, there is a incredibly dedicated force of voting rights lawyers that will ensure that the law is followed, that there will be no kind of sitting back from either. I really believe in the election officials across this country, that they will not sit back and have their power taken from them, and that they will protect the voters, and that they know that they also have an incredible resource in the community of voting rights lawyers and advocates to support both election officials and voters in making sure that our elections look normal in 2026, just as Justin has predicted. It's our job to follow through on that.
Thanks, Danielle. Thanks so much. So, one of the problems is that people would believe the things that come out of the White House. Like, for example, there's one question in the chat from Elena Kuznetsova. I'm going to read it in the interest of time. Talking about the options to vote, just 1 hour before this briefing, there was a post on the White House Facebook page saying no mail-in ballots, except for illness, military, disability, or travel. Does it mean that many voters will lose the opportunity to vote legally via mail this fall? He cannot make that determination, from what I understand. So please explain that.
He most certainly cannot. That is just so far outside the scope of anything that the president has power over. Rules about absentee ballots are set by the states. The only rules that federal law includes at this moment about absentee ballots are requiring certain access to absentee ballots for certain voters, like uniformed and overseas voters, as I mentioned. But there are no federal rules that kind of restrict states' ability to extend absentee voting. As you all know, the vast majority of states have very broad access to absentee voting. And one thing I'll say is that there has been a lot of tweeting or whatever social mediaing about this issue coming from the White House, with a lot of promises about how an executive order is coming. I am more than prepared for such an executive order if it comes, but I think the reason why it has not come is it does not write. Because there is, as Justin said, no way for the federal government to even try to operationalize an attempt to take away absentee voting. Donald Trump can say no mail-in voting as much as he would like, and I can promise you that for example, the state of Washington is still going to send out their absentee ballots as promised.
All right. There's another question quickly before we go on. From Aitana Vargas. She says, days ago, CNN reported that there's widespread support for a national voter ID. How likely is this initiative to be implemented? Any comments on that?
Yeah, so as Justin mentioned, there are a few bills being considered by either the House or the Senate right now, mostly the SAVE Act or other versions of the SAVE Act, to SAVE Act 2.0 or whatnot.
The Mega Act.
Yeah. Mega Act as it may be. They're more or less the same, and they are more or less not supported by the American people. So one thing, as somebody who has worked in elections for a decade, I know that what matters in these questions is the level of specificity. Sure, Americans support some sort of way to verify voters and identify them. Great. Every state has a way that they identify voters at the polls. And that has been the case for a long time. In fact, the National Voter Registration Act has ways in which we ensure that voters, when they register, get verified and identified either through some sort of physical identification or through a database. So I agree that Americans support identifying voters and verifying them. Voters do not support an act that would disenfranchise millions of Americans and make it so that, for example, married women have difficulty proving their eligibility to vote. And we know that. We stand ready to kind of oppose that bill because we know that it's bad for voters, and we know that if voters know the facts, they will know that it's bad for them. They have been pushing this bill for quite some time, and they have not made movement yet. So we will continue to watch it. I don't like to ever prognosticate, but I don't think that Americans support the legislation that's being pushed right now. However much they might support kind of in the abstract, the idea of identifying voters, which we already do.
Right. Yeah, it all depends on how they ask the question, who they ask the question from, etc. Thank you, Danielle. Thank you so much. I'm going to go to our next speaker, and that is John C. Yang, President and Executive Director of Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC. Please, John, tell us what the impact is of all of this on your community and other vulnerable communities.
Sure. Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to be with all of you, especially my fellow co-panelists, all of whom I've had the pleasure of working with throughout each of our careers. The purpose of our organization, the mission of our organization, is to advance the civil and human rights of Asian Americans and to promote a fair and equitable society for all. And I think certainly when it comes to voting rights, that is a critical pillar in what we are talking about. I always want to start in these presentations by talking about the fundamental premise of America, which is that voting is a right. It's not a privilege, it's a right for all citizens. And to the question that was posed earlier about voter ID and public support, it is clear in all of the polling that we and others have done, people strongly favor making voting easier, not harder. So therefore, what we should always be looking at is, what is the burden being posed on American citizens to voting versus what is the benefit of having having any type of restrictive law? Unless someone can demonstrate that the benefit of a restriction absolutely outweighs the burden, it's a done deal. When it comes to the Asian American community, certainly we see how these burdens potentially play out. To backtrack a little bit, I think it's always useful to talk about who the Asian American community is. We're the fastest growing population here in the United States. Between 2010 and 2020, our population grew by over 38%. And what that translates into is about 24 million Asian Americans living in the United States today. We are projected to be upwards of around 35 million in the United States by 2060. So we represent about 7.2% of our American population. When it comes to voting, we are seeing an absolute increase in the number of Asian Americans that are voting. The 2020 election showed over 1.8 million additional eligible voters from the previous presidential election, and even a higher increase in Asian Americans who actually registered and voted. That represents a 28% increase in registered Asian Americans, and a 37% increase in Asian Americans who voted between the 2016 and the 2020 elections. For the 2020 election, almost 60% of eligible Asian Americans voters turned out. So to put that number in perspective, that means it's about almost 8 million people. In states such as Arizona, Georgia, Nevada, North Carolina, and Pennsylvania, the number of Asian Americans who cast their ballots in 2020 exceeded the presidential margin of victory. So our vote clearly matters. And when we look at who is voting, one of the interesting things to note is that 1 in 8 Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander voters voted for the first time in 2024. So 12.5% of our community voted for the first time in 2024. Young Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander voters cast their ballots for the first time for about 28% of that community. Also, what that means for the Asian American community? few facts. First is we have our first ever Asian American senator from New Jersey, Andy Kim, which raises our number of Asian American senators to 3 out of the group of 100 that sit in the Senate. In Virginia, my home state, Suha Subramaniam became the first ever Indian American to be in the House of Representatives. So now in the House of Representatives, we have 17 Asian Americans, Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders. On the Senate side, we have 3. Also, in terms of local election, everyone knows about Zoran Mamdani, who became the New York's first Asian American mayor or mayor of Asian American descent. And then in Boston and Cincinnati, Michelle Wu and Aftab Puraval, respectively, won their re-elections for mayor. So what does this mean in terms of what we're looking at in terms of voting? Yeah, up until the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, laws barring Asian Americans from immigrating to the United States from becoming naturalized citizens and even testifying in court prevented our communities from participating in the democratic process. Unfortunately, as we've talked about today, we see an attempt at eroding voting rights by the administration, by certain state governments. Between voter intimidation, redistricting, threats to language access, limitations on early and absentee voting, deceptive practices, and racially motivated challenges, the right to vote is under attack. Exclusionary laws, often driven by this fear of the other and the potential threat to the political livelihood of those in power, kept Asian Americans and other minorities disenfranchised. This is not only a problem of the past, but it is a problem of the present. And part of this problem is this perception of foreigners, which we as Asian Americans recognize, falling into what we often talk about as the perpetual foreigner myth. No matter how long we've been in this country, we are perceived as outsiders, aliens, not real Americans. And the reality is that more and more marginalized communities have become politically visible and viable in jurisdictions throughout the country, not only in gateway cities, the large metropolitans that we talk about, but in rural areas as well. So in terms of the issues that we care about, number one would be language access. The reality is about 30% of Asian Americans are limited English proficient. So in navigating any sort of document, let alone a document that could be as complicated as a ballot, which we all know, depending on the ballots, yes, maybe the top line candidates, president, vice president, et cetera, is easy. But when you start getting into the referendum, the bond issues, even we as English native speaking people have difficulties navigating that. So imagine what that might look like for someone who is limited English proficient. So as a result, we, among other things, have a language assistance hotline, 1-800-API-VOTE, that we have conducted over many, many years that really helps to navigate language issues. As an example, although this didn't involve a language issue, we had a call from a mother from Maine who was calling on behalf of her daughter. Her daughter was asking for help because of a disability, but the poll worker told them that they wouldn't help her. So we actually escalated it to the Disability Rights Maine to ensure that that voter got the assistance that they needed. And actually why link disabilities with language access is that it actually falls under the same section of the voting rights, what's called Section 208, which requires that assistance with disabilities, assistance with language be provided at the polls. Now, voting can be complicated. So for those whose first language isn't English, understanding all of this is definitely an issue. For us as Asian Americans, we're extremely diverse, over dozens and dozens of different ethnicities and languages. So making sure that we have access to language is important. Number two would be addressing mis and disinformation spread on social media. And so I really appreciate the reporters here thinking about these issues, talking about these issues, and reporting about these issues in a real way. Even the example of what appeared on the White House Facebook page about trying to say that there is no longer going to be early voting. It only requires in-person voting. As Danielle mentioned, that is completely false. But unless we have reporters that make clear that this is not a power that the president can have, people reading just simply the Facebook page could feel like, all right, I've already lost my right to vote unless I go in person and not even try. That's what we want to make sure that does not happen. One thing that we noted when it comes to misinformation, disinformation, is that it is a tactic that we've seen. So we monitored misinformation, disinformation in Asian languages as part of our work, that we've seen this as a tactic used to try to disenfranchise voters, to try to intimidate voters. There's also a number of discriminatory laws that we've already talked about with respect to what voting looks like that has a specific effect on Asian Americans. We've talked about voter ID. Just as, like Danielle said, voter ID can't impact people that get married and change their last names. For Asian Americans, most of whom are naturalized still in the United States, their names, unless there is what is called an exact match, could cause issues in certain states that have these types of laws. As you might imagine, finding, and even for myself speaking personally, the number of different IDs I have and how my middle name is spelled, which is a transliteration of my Chinese name, could make it very difficult in terms of saying, oh, your social security card matches your passport, matches my birth certificate is not even a US birth certificate. So finding the right documents that would justify me being able to vote. And like we talked about, laws that limit the ability to vote by mail and absentee voting is important for Asian Americans. In the 2024 election, almost 50%, 46.5% to be exact, of Asian Americans voted by mail. We see this as important in part because of the language access issue, recognizing that having that ballot at home allows us additional time to translate, think through the issue in a way that you would feel pressured to do so at the ballot box in person. So any attempts to address that and to limit that would be seen as a challenge to the Asian American community. So in terms of what we can do, in addition to running our election protection hotline, we actually, like Danielle, we litigate. So we're part of the coalition that was able to get the permanent injunction, the summary judgment in DC for the executive order on voting. We had another case in Arizona on what's called a voter purge, eliminating voters from the files that were successful. That's something that we all need to continue to do. Making sure that people are informed about what the voting laws are and are not. The fact that you're entitled to language assistance. The fact that language assistance does not have to be provided by a citizen, does not even have to be provided by a family member, is important for people to recognize what their rights are to go into the ballot box. Look, our voices, our votes really matter. Together we can continue to protect these. We need to continue to join with other civil rights groups, many of the ones represented here, to inform the public, to let them know. Our democracy is just too important for us not to care about and not to stay informed about and not to exercise that right to vote. Thank you very much. Always look forward to questions from this group.
Thank you so much. And we're going to move. I'm going to move on and invite the following speaker to speak, and then we'll take questions with the time we have left because we're running late. Thank you, John. And welcome to Andrea Centeno. She's DC Regional Counsel for MALDEF, the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund. Andrea, please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you all for having me here today and for including MALDEF in this discussion. Just really briefly, for those who are not as familiar with MALDEF as an organization, we are the leading civil rights legal organization working on behalf of all Latinos living in the United States. We're headquartered in Los Angeles, but we have offices across the country, including in Chicago, San Antonio, and Washington, D.C. And since its founding, one of MALDEF's top priorities has been to secure equal voting rights for Latinos and to promote increased civic engagement and participation within the Latino community. So these issues are very central, right, to our organization historically. Similar to John, I'm going to provide a little bit of background, right, of the Latino population in the U.S. to contextualize these voting issues. The Latino population in the U.S. has grown steadily over the last several decades, and Latinos have been the largest racial or ethnic minority group in the U.S. for more than 2 decades. We know from the last census, Latinos make up 19% of the total U.S. population, and we accounted for 51% of the nation's growth between 2010 and 2020. So that overall growth also translates into a significant portion of the growing US electorate. And Latino citizens, we were the largest racial or ethnic non-white voting group, or group of voting age, I should say, in 2020 and 2024. An estimated 1.8 million Latinos become eligible to vote each year. So with that, we're looking at significant growth in our community, significant growth in the electorate. But when we look at rates of voter registration and rates of voter participation among the racial groups, including for Latinos, there are still very significant gaps in those turnout rates and in those registration rates. And that really demonstrates that there is still significant voter suppression and voter discrimination that occurs. And some of the tactics that we see officials use to deny access to the ballot or to dilute the vote of the Latino community or other communities of color, those look like unlawful voter purges, restrictions on language assistance that John talked about, restrictions on mail ballots that you've been hearing discussed today, and forms of registering, especially when those forms of registration or voting, right, are disproportionately used by voters of color in a jurisdiction. And then, as you've heard today, right, we've been talking a little bit about these more recent calls for nationalizing elections and legislation to require proof of citizenship in order to register to vote or maybe to cast a ballot in the context of the MEGA Act. And, this unsettling kind of recent discussion or recent calls for ICE presence at the polls. All of these tactics, right, they predictably target Latinos and other voters of color. And so just, I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of how all of this translates for, what that impact looks like for Latino voters and other voters of color, but then also talk a little bit about kind of beyond the broad national kind of discussion around nationalizing elections, some of the more technical ways in which election changes can affect and restrict the right to vote for Latino voters and other voters. So when we're looking at kind of what's been happening more recently, as you've heard about the SAVE Act and now the newly introduced Save America Act and the Make Elections Great Again Act, which is going to get a hearing next week. All of these kind of pieces of legislation that are there to require, under those bills, there would be requirements for proof of citizenship to register or maybe to vote. Those have a disproportionate harmful effect on the Latino electorate. And those bills do two things. If they were enacted, they would make it much harder for people to register and to vote. And two, they create intentionally confusion and fear and distrust, which ultimately deters eligible voters from participating in elections. So when we're looking at the barriers themselves, there's studies and litigation, right, has shown many times over that citizenship documents like birth certificates, naturalization documents, passports, those are hard to get. And that access to these types of documents, it's unequal across racial and ethnic groups. Voters of color are less likely to have those documents. They're also more likely to have a harder time obtaining them when they don't have them. So as a result, predictably, those voters, including Latino voters, they're going to face a greater hurdle to registering and participating if things like the SAVE Act, the Save America Act, Make Elections Great Again Act were to pass. But they also produce confusion and fear. And that, these bills, as you've heard, they are based on this disinformation and these false narratives about the security of our elections. And a lot of that is rooted in kind of attributing that fraud to non-citizen immigrant Latinos. And so it is very, very much connected to the growth of the Latino population, to the growth of the growing numbers of non-white voters in the electorate. But ultimately, what it also does, right, is create this very credible risk of harassment and intimidation of U.S. citizens who don't look like a US citizen or look like an eligible voter just because of their race or their ethnicity or the fact that they may not be proficient in English. And that's very concerning given the increase in immigration enforcement that we've been seeing across communities, in communities across the country. And then, like I said, these kind of calls that we've been seeing in the larger discussion, right, for placing ICE at or near poll sites. All of that, likely deters eligible voters from casting their ballots. So for an organization like MALDEF, right, making sure that individuals are well informed of their rights, are well informed of who to turn to when they confront a barrier or are confronted with that type of unlawful behavior, so that they know how to enforce their own rights in that situation. These are all very large kind of in addition to those kind of larger, more existential threats to voting, which are significant, there are also many ways in which, the barriers to voting look a little less obvious and a little more technical in nature, but the impact is the same in disenfranchising voters, and the impact is the same in that the disproportionate harm falls on Latino voters and falls on voters of color. One example of that John discussed is the restriction on voter assistance. And some states have been adopting restrictions to who can help a voter who needs it cast a ballot. So that's why MALDEF sued in Arkansas to challenge a 2020 state law that said that an individual couldn't help more than 6 voters in an election. And we brought that, challenge under Section 208 of the Voting Rights Act that John mentioned. And that provision, that arbitrary limit that was put in place by the state, it means that a voter who needs assistance because they're a voter with a disability or because they're a voter who has the inability to read or write in English, and even though they're guaranteed that assistance under federal law, they can't receive that assistance from the person of their choosing if that assister had already helped 6 people in the election. And for the assister, they face criminal prosecution and fines, if they help more than 6 voters in an election. Similarly, in Texas, when they passed their anti-voter SB1 bill in 2021, it also contained a provision that restricted voter assistance. And there, it criminalized for a voter to compensate their assister. And the law also banned employees of social service organizations from assisting voters with their mail ballots. So in other words, in that situation, a voter with a disability, a voter who's elderly, or a voter who can't read or write in English would face potential jail time for offering to buy a friend lunch as a small token of appreciation for helping them with their ballot. It also meant that, there are nonprofit organizations like our client there, La Unión del Pueblo Entero, that help members, their own members, right, complete their mail-in ballots if they're asked. They're no longer able to provide that assistance and instead would have to turn those voters away. I'll say that those laws had been upheld by the 8th and 5th Circuits respectively for different reasons. And just last week, MALDEF filed to seek Supreme Court review in those 2 separate cases. I know I'm running out on time.
Can you wrap up, please? Yes,
so
please,
I'll just say
please
there are
wrap
many
up.
ways in which technical changes can affect access to the ballot. And so I thank you for having me here and happy to answer questions.
Thank you. Thank you. We always run out of time. We have so many good questions. But, I like this question right here. Lilia Galindo is asking, and I'm going to throw it out for anyone who wants to comment on this, because here again is the idea that something can happen that really literally the law doesn't support. Can the Supreme Court intervene in favor of President Trump and just give him control of the election? Justin, Danielle, or any of you? You're all lawyers, so.
I mean, it is tough to say what the Supreme Court will or won't do these days. They've been doing a lot of stuff that I think all of our lawyers on the call haven't expected. But I don't think the answer is flat no, according to the Constitution. And also, there's no reason to think that they would. the Supreme Court justices think of themselves, whether we think of them that way or not, as a little bit above the muck and the mire of the day to day. And so they're plenty happy to move the law in big ways or small ways, but I don't actually think they have an interest in intervening in small bore elections for one particular person or one particular party. And so they think of themselves as loftier than that, whether that's right or wrong. But also, that's not a thing that's going to happen.
Yeah, I will say I'm not 100%. The Supreme Court has been doing a lot to harm the rights of voters, and I will not sugarcoat that in any way. I think I agree with Justin that, first of all, I just don't see a legal path for kind of like handing power to the president, however much some might want to try. So I just don't see the path, and so I don't see a pathway for the justices to get there. The other thing is, there were many attempts to get the Supreme Court to step in 2020, and this was not an area that the court showed any appetite for. And so while there are many concerns I have about this court's direction on the law and its fealty to voters on that particular question of interfering with an election, especially after an election has been run, the court has been asked to do that in recent history and has declined to do so. And in fact, in a recent opinion about a technical standing issue, the Supreme Court specifically said that deciding rules after an election has been run is not a recipe for a good democracy, which I think was a signal.
Okay, so we only have 3 minutes left, and there's a question in the chat, the last question that was put on there, and I'm just going to throw it out for all of you to answer. What actions can communities and civil rights groups take to protect fair access to voting? Maybe John, you want to go with that? And
Sure.
Andrea?
I'll start and then I'll have my colleagues jump in. Number one is certainly we as civil rights groups, we are going to continue to litigate. We're going to continue to inform our communities about what their rights are so that that will give them confidence because they have probably more rights than they realize when it comes to, again, language assistance, sort of voter intimidation, what you can do about it, all of that. So part of this is to make sure that, again, with the power of all the reporters here, to make sure that they understand we have a robust system that can protect the vote. And then with respect to the communities themselves, I would ask them to stay informed and have confidence. Because I think, again, to what Justin was saying, a lot of this is a PR campaign. They're trying to sow lack of confidence in our community so that we don't bother to vote. If anything, we should be defiant in making sure that we vote.
And I'll just quickly add to that, part of being an informed voter, right? Part of that is the important work that you all are doing to give people really correct information about what the status of the law is, what they need to know in order to register to vote or to know about what they're going to confront at the poll site. And, part of that is, giving them the information they need and that they should be building a plan and looking at this as a community endeavor to go vote.
All right, last words from Justin or Danielle on this?
So I put a little bit in the chat, but it's just echoing exactly what John and Andrea said. Voters have agency here. We're in charge. And the more you can communicate that we are the ones who are in charge here, that we get to decide our own destiny, some of the suggestions that Danielle made, be a poll worker, sign up to actually be a volunteer at the polls, sign up to work with the organizations that are out there monitoring or assisting other voters. And for voters themselves, make sure that people have a plan to register and check their registration and a plan to vote. And that will actually make sure that people can exercise all of the rights that John and Andrea and Danielle have been talking about and keep us in charge.
Right. Okay. Danielle, anything else you want to add?
Only that I think that attempts to control and restrict voters are a reflection of voters' own power, and they can assert it. And I've actually seen real life examples of attempts to restrict the vote backfiring because voters will not have it. You make it harder to show up at the polls, voters will overcome those barriers because Americans stand in that power.
Thank you. And somebody commented in the chat, excellent panel. Your confidence is helpful in these times. I agree. Thank you so much to all the panelists and to all the journalists for being with us today. I'm sorry, it's night here where I am. And have a good weekend, everyone.